Imagine you're on a plane, thousands of feet in the air. Suddenly, the calm journey turns into something unforgettable. A baby is born mid-flight, a snake slithers out from the overhead compartment, a jet faces a terrifying fuel crisis, a passenger tries to open the emergency door, and one aircraft even lands at the wrong airport entirely. These aren't scenes from a movie, they're real events that left passengers and crew stunned. If you're ready to uncover the 5 most unbelievable incidents that happened in the skies, stay with us until the end, you won't want to miss a single story. And before we take off, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel, because we bring you the most fascinating stories from around the world, every week. It was supposed to be an ordinary international flight, cruising smoothly above the clouds. The cabin lights were dimmed, most passengers were dozing off, and the hum of the engines created a lullaby-like background noise. But then, in the middle of the night, a commotion broke out in row 23. A young woman, visibly distressed, was gripping the armrests of her seat. At first, the flight attendants thought it was turbulence-induced anxiety. But within moments, the truth became clear: she was going into labor, 30,000 feet above the ground. The passengers around her were stunned. Gasps echoed through the cabin as a flight attendant knelt down, her training kicking in. "Is there a doctor on board?" The classic phrase rang out, and sure enough, a hand shot up. An obstetrician, of all specialties, happened to be on board. What were the odds? The crew quickly transformed the cramped airplane aisle into an improvised delivery room. Blankets were gathered, medical kits opened, and other passengers stepped in to help. Some held up privacy screens using jackets, while others fetched water and comforted the soon-to-be mother. The atmosphere in the cabin shifted from fear to unity. Strangers who had never spoken a word to each other suddenly became part of a team, focused on one incredible task: bringing a new life into the world. The doctor gave calm, steady instructions as turbulence rattled the plane. The mother-to-be, breathing heavily, gripped the hand of a flight attendant as contractions intensified. After what felt like hours, but in reality was less than 30 minutes, the cries of a newborn pierced through the drone of the engines. Passengers erupted in applause, some with tears in their eyes. A baby had just been born, mid-air, in one of the most unlikely delivery rooms imaginable. The crew improvised a tiny crib from blankets and placed the baby in the mother's arms. It was a boy, healthy and strong, and his first view of the world was not a hospital ceiling, but the endless sky. The captain even made a special announcement, his voice trembling with emotion: "Ladies and gentlemen, we have just welcomed a new passenger on board, born in flight." But perhaps the most fascinating twist came later. Aviation law states that a baby born mid-flight can sometimes be granted citizenship based on the airspace where the birth occurred, or even on the country of the airline itself. Imagine being born not in one nation, but in the skies above them all. That baby would forever carry a story no one else could match. The passengers who witnessed it would never forget that flight. For them, air travel would no longer be routine. It had become the place where life itself began. And yet, this was just the start of our unbelievable journey. Because while one plane brought new life into the world, another carried something far more sinister, a slithering surprise that no passenger could ever prepare for. The flight had been calm, uneventful, almost boring. Passengers were settling in with their headphones, watching movies, or sipping lukewarm coffee from paper cups. The air was filled with the faint scent of reheated meals, the rustle of magazines, and the steady drone of the engines. Nothing suggested that this trip would turn into a scene straight out of a thriller. It started with a scream. At first, people assumed it was a child throwing a tantrum. But then heads began to turn toward the middle of the cabin, where a passenger stood frozen, pointing at the overhead compartment. Something long and dark had slipped through the crack and was slowly dangling into the aisle. A snake. For a moment, silence gripped the cabin, broken only by the hiss of the creature as it slid further down. Panic erupted instantly. Passengers jumped out of their seats, knocking over drinks, dropping headphones, and scrambling toward the front or back of the plane. The snake slithered along the aisle, its scales glistening under the cabin lights. It wasn't huge, but in the confined, inescapable space of an aircraft, even a small snake felt like a predator from a nightmare. The flight attendants, caught between fear and responsibility, tried to calm everyone down. "Please remain seated, we are handling the situation," one of them shouted, though her trembling voice betrayed her own fear. The crew quickly notified the cockpit, and the captain's voice soon came over the intercom, "Ladies and gentlemen, please stay calm. We are aware of the situation. We will be making an unscheduled landing shortly." But shortly wasn't soon enough for the terrified passengers trapped with the reptile. Some stood on their seats, clutching their bags as shields. Others tried to help, tossing jackets or blankets in an attempt to pin the snake down. One brave passenger, an off-duty wildlife handler, as it turned out, stepped forward. With the crew's permission, he used the very tools at hand, a pair of thick gloves from the emergency kit and a large empty catering container. The cabin fell into a tense hush as he slowly approached the snake, which had now coiled near row 17. Every move felt agonizingly slow. The snake flicked its tongue, testing the air, while passengers held their breath. Then, in a swift motion, the man grabbed it just behind the head, lifted it off the ground, and stuffed it into the container. The lid snapped shut, and the entire cabin erupted in cheers and applause. Relief washed over the passengers like a wave. No one knew exactly how the snake had made it on board. Some suspected it had been hidden in someone's carry-on luggage, smuggled either intentionally or by accident. Others whispered about it crawling in during cargo loading. Whatever the origin, one thing was clear: this flight had given its passengers a story they would never forget, and perhaps a lifelong fear of overhead compartments. As the plane made its emergency landing at the nearest airport, the passengers stepped off with shaky legs and wide eyes. Some even kissed the ground. Because when you're trapped 35,000 feet in the air with a serpent in your aisle, every second feels like a lifetime. But as wild as this was, the skies had even more terrifying challenges in store. Because sometimes, the real danger isn't a living creature, it's the plane itself running out of the very thing it needs to stay in the sky: fuel. The flight had begun like any other, boarding completed, passengers buckled in, and the aircraft climbing smoothly through the clouds. Outside the windows, the world shrank into a quilt of green and blue, while inside, the cabin hummed with the comforting monotony of air travel. Most passengers had no idea that behind the closed door of the cockpit, a slow-burning crisis was quietly unfolding. It began with a blinking light on the instrument panel. At first, the captain thought it was a faulty sensor. Fuel discrepancies happen, and usually, they're nothing more than a minor technical glitch. But when the co-pilot cross-checked the gauges and recalculated, the numbers didn't add up. The plane was losing fuel, and no one knew why. The captain's heartbeat quickened. He alerted air traffic control, reporting a possible leak, while the co-pilot began running emergency checklists. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain's voice finally echoed through the cabin, calm yet unnervingly firm, "we are experiencing a technical issue. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We are taking every precaution to ensure your safety." In the cabin, a ripple of unease spread. Passengers exchanged worried glances, clutching their armrests a little tighter. Some tried to laugh it off, others stared at the flight attendants, searching for reassurance. But even the crew's forced smiles couldn't fully mask the tension in their eyes. As the flight continued, the situation worsened. Fuel levels dropped faster than expected. The nearest airport was still hundreds of miles away, and the aircraft's range was shrinking by the minute. There was no option but to divert immediately. The co-pilot contacted air traffic control again, requesting an emergency landing. But the controller's response chilled the cockpit. The nearest suitable airport was across the ocean, and the fuel margins were dangerously thin. "You'll need to glide in," came the stark warning. The cockpit fell silent for a moment. Gliding, a maneuver where the engines cut out and the plane essentially becomes a powerless glider, was something pilots practiced in simulators, not something they ever hoped to attempt in real life. Back in the cabin, panic was spreading. Some passengers whispered prayers under their breath, others clutched their loved ones tightly. A baby began crying, its wails piercing through the tense silence. The captain made the decision: they would attempt to glide. He briefed the crew, who moved quickly through the cabin, demonstrating brace positions and urging everyone to stay calm. The reality was harsh: every move had to be perfect, every calculation precise. One mistake, and the aircraft wouldn't make it. As the engines sputtered and fell silent, the once familiar roar of flight gave way to an eerie quiet. The only sound was the rushing wind outside as the plane descended in a powerless glide. Passengers gripped their seats, some closing their eyes, others staring in disbelief at the surreal silence. Then, against all odds, the runway appeared on the horizon. The captain's hands were steady, his voice calm as he guided the massive aircraft toward its final descent. The plane touched down hard, bouncing once before settling onto the asphalt with a screech of tires. When it finally came to a halt, the cabin erupted in tears, cheers, and stunned silence. The passengers had survived what few ever experience: a powerless descent from the sky. And though everyone walked away safely, the memory of those silent minutes, dangling between life and death, would haunt them forever. But not all dangers come from failing machinery. Sometimes, the greatest threat is another passenger, one whose actions endanger everyone on board. The flight had been smooth, almost boringly uneventful. Passengers read magazines, watched movies, or dozed off beneath the soft hum of the engines. Flight attendants moved quietly down the aisles, serving drinks with polite smiles. It was the kind of routine flight where time seemed to melt away, until one man stood up. At first, no one paid attention. After all, people frequently stretched their legs on long flights. But then, a flight attendant noticed his eyes. Wide, darting, restless. He wasn't heading toward the restroom, nor was he waiting in line. Instead, he walked with purpose toward the nearest exit door. At 35,000 feet, the thought of anyone touching that door was enough to send shivers down the spine. Air pressure alone makes it nearly impossible to open in mid-flight, but the sight of someone even trying sparks primal fear. The man reached the handle, wrapped his hand around it, and began to tug. The cabin erupted in chaos. A passenger screamed, another shouted, "He's trying to open the door." Suddenly, dozens of eyes locked onto the unfolding nightmare. Flight attendants dropped everything and rushed forward, but in those few seconds, time stretched unbearably long. A group of passengers leapt from their seats. They weren't waiting for help, instinct took over. A businessman in a suit, a young athlete, even a grandmother with surprising strength, all lunged at the man at once. The aisle became a frenzy of flailing arms and shouts as they wrestled him away from the door. The struggle was brutal. The man shouted incoherently, his words lost in the panic. Was he delirious? Having a breakdown? Or something far more sinister? No one knew. All they could see was his desperation to reach that handle again. Finally, with sheer force, the group managed to pin him to the floor. Flight attendants hurried over with restraints, special heavy-duty zip ties carried for exactly these kinds of emergencies. It took several attempts, but eventually his hands were bound, his legs secured. The man thrashed and yelled, but the threat was contained. Yet the fear lingered. Even after he was subdued, passengers glanced nervously toward the door, as if expecting it to suddenly burst open. Mothers held their children closer, couples whispered prayers. The cabin crew tried to soothe everyone, explaining firmly that it was physically impossible to open the door mid-flight due to the pressure difference. But logic was no match for the raw memory of what they'd just witnessed. The restrained passenger was moved to the back of the plane, guarded by crew members and volunteers who refused to sit down again. Hours stretched on, but no one truly relaxed until the plane finally descended and the runway came into view. The moment the wheels touched down, a collective sigh of relief spread through the cabin. But the drama wasn't over. Police officers stormed the aircraft the second the doors opened, taking the restrained man into custody. His face was pale, his eyes glassy. Later, reports suggested he had been experiencing a severe mental health crisis, but for those on board, the reason mattered little. What they remembered was the terrifying sight of a fellow passenger reaching for the door handle, the raw panic of those minutes, and the extraordinary bravery of strangers who risked themselves to protect everyone else. But just when you think the worst is over, the skies sometimes play a cruel trick. Because what if the danger isn't inside the cabin, but waiting on the ground? For passengers, the final moments of a flight are usually filled with relief. The seatbelt sign lights up, the captain's calm voice announces the descent, and everyone prepares for landing. People stretch, gather their belongings, and glance out the windows to catch the first glimpse of their destination. That's exactly what was happening on this flight, except that destination wasn't where the plane was supposed to be. It began innocently enough. The captain announced, "Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our approach. Weather is clear, and we should be on the ground shortly." Passengers relaxed, some even applauded quietly. But outside, the night sky hid a dangerous truth: the plane was lining up with the wrong runway. In aviation, precision is everything. Airports look surprisingly similar from above, especially smaller ones near larger hubs. And that evening, the pilot mistook one airfield for another, just a few miles apart. The problem? One runway was designed for large commercial jets. The other wasn't. As the plane descended, a few observant passengers noticed something odd. "That runway looks short," someone whispered, peering out the window. Another murmured, "Where are the terminal lights? Shouldn't we see the city skyline?" But before the unease could spread, the wheels slammed onto the tarmac with a deafening screech. The cabin jolted violently. Coffee cups flew, bags tumbled from overhead bins, and frightened screams filled the air. The plane had landed, yes, but the runway beneath them was half the length it should have been. The engines roared at full reverse thrust, brakes screamed, and every passenger felt their body shoved forward against the seatbelts. Seconds stretched like hours. Would they stop in time? Or would the plane skid off the edge into darkness? Finally, with just meters to spare, the aircraft screeched to a halt. Silence. Then, a nervous laugh. Then another. But most passengers sat frozen, realizing how close they had come to disaster. When the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, it was unusually tense. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome, to, the wrong airport. Gasps filled the cabin. Wrong airport? How could that even happen? Ground crews scrambled in disbelief. This airport wasn't equipped for large jets, and there were no proper facilities to handle so many passengers. Worse, the short runway meant taking off again would be extremely risky. For hours, passengers were stuck in limbo, stranded at an airport that wasn't even meant to receive them. News spread quickly. Headlines blared, passenger jet lands at wrong airport, runway almost too short. Aviation experts weighed in, pointing out the razor-thin margin between survival and catastrophe. Had the plane touched down even slightly further along the runway, the outcome might have been deadly. For the passengers, the memory was seared into their minds: the screech of rubber on asphalt, the burning smell of overheated brakes, the stunned faces of those around them. Many said later that, in those terrifying seconds, they thought it was the end. Eventually, arrangements were made. Buses transported the passengers to their intended destination, while the plane remained grounded until engineers determined if it could safely take off again. For many on board, though, the damage was done. Trust in the skies had been shaken forever. And yet, as shocking as this mistake was, aviation history holds even stranger stories. Because sometimes, survival in the air isn't about landing in the wrong place, it's about whether you can land at all. When we think of air travel, we often imagine it as the pinnacle of safety and precision, a carefully choreographed dance of technology and discipline. But as these stories reveal, the skies are never entirely predictable. They are a stage where human fragility, mechanical limits, and the sheer force of nature sometimes collide in the most unexpected ways. From a baby taking its first breath thousands of feet above the ground, to a serpent slithering between rows of seats, to a jet fighting for fuel and survival, each moment reminds us that airplanes carry more than passengers. They carry stories. Stories that defy expectation, blur the line between danger and miracle, and forever etch themselves into the memories of those on board. And perhaps that is why these incidents stay with us long after the wheels touch the runway. Because in them, we see the full spectrum of the human experience: fear and hope, chaos and order, fragility and resilience. A mother cradling her newborn in the sky. A captain calculating fuel down to the final drop. A passenger battling panic as a fellow traveler lunges for the emergency door. A community gasping as a jetliner mistakenly lands at the wrong airport. Each episode could have ended in disaster. And yet, they didn't. Each story bends toward survival, toward life continuing against the odds. What do these tales teach us? That the skies are not just about destinations. They are about the journeys in between, the unplanned, the unthinkable, the unforgettable. They remind us that while airplanes are marvels of engineering, it is the human heart, the will to endure, to protect, to act in the face of fear, that truly keeps us aloft. So the next time you board a plane, look around. Among the quiet passengers reading books, scrolling screens, or staring out at endless clouds, remember, every flight is a story waiting to be written. Some will be ordinary. Others, extraordinary. And maybe, just maybe, one day the tale that echoes through the skies will be yours.